Hey everyone, welcome back to Wicked Deeds. We're your hosts. I'm Brittany.
And I'm John.
And today we'll be discussing a case where a Canadian female who was an avid hiker set out on a solo expedition to the White Mountains of New Hampshire, but never returned home. With her family fearing for her well-being, the woman was reported missing. Days later, with multiple agencies scouring the wooded trails, hoping to find and save the lost or injured traveler, they instead found themselves in a worst-case scenario. Today's case is about the murder of Louise Chaput. Before we dive into this episode, I just want to preface it with a comment about Louise's last name and its pronunciation. I've done as much research as I possibly can on how her last name is pronounced, but honestly, there isn't a ton of news coverage on this case in the United States, outside of just one I found with WMUR from 2011. But based on that news coverage and a French podcast that covered this case and kind of mashing those two pronunciations together, also without any real knowledge of the French language, I'm going to pronounce her last name Chaput. That's what I'm going to go with throughout this episode, and I do apologize if I'm not saying it perfectly. So with that, let's dive in. Louise Chaput was 52 years old at the time this story begins in November of 2001. Before this, though, she'd been living with her longtime boyfriend Pierre in Sherbrooke, Quebec, Canada. According to the Conway Daily Sun, she was a self-employed psychologist and more specifically worked in the marriage counseling field. I've also seen it reported that at some point she worked with prison inmates at a detention center located in Sherbrooke, the same town she lived in. However, I don't know exactly when or for how long she worked there.
A lot of prison inmates going through marriage counseling?
Well, no, I think I think in 2001, or at least like right before that, she had most likely moved into marriage counseling, but at some point before it, I think she was in the detention center. But yeah, regardless, she's working in the psychology field. So.
Gotcha.
Louise had two daughters, one named Corinne, who was 19 in 2001, and a younger daughter named Constance, who was 10 at the time. It was also reported that she raised her daughters on her own, but had met her boyfriend Pierre when Corinne was just 5 years old, so that's the older daughter. I don't know exactly the dynamic within the family and who the girls' fathers were, but either way, similarly to last week's case, that of Judy Smith, Louise was incredibly outdoorsy and was described as having this passion for life and adventure. She also loved to hike, and she did that often as she was a very active individual. A friend of Louise's described her for the Concord Monitor and stated, quote, "Louise was a very strong, independent woman who had a mind of her own," end quote. Okay, so now we're going to dive into the timeline and sequence of events of this case. So on Thursday, November 15th, 2001, Louise was set to make a trip down to the United States. She hopped into her 2001 silver Ford Focus station wagon to make the drive from her home in Sherbrooke, Quebec, to a hiking location that was a part of the Appalachian Mountain Club located in Gorham, New Hampshire. And she was planning to take a solo vacation down there to spend a few days hiking in the White Mountains. It was also reported that she would be staying at a place known as the Joe Dodge Lodge, which was in the vicinity of the location where she was said to be planning to hike. It seems as though the lodge and another place called the Pinkham Notch Visitor Center, where Louise planned to go, were kind of like within this Appalachian Mountain Club. And from what I can tell, the Appalachian Mountain Club is like the overarching group, per se. And then depending on the hiking location, trailheads, etc., there were different places where people could hike these trails, stay the night, all that good stuff.
Gotcha. Solo trip though, huh?
Yes, and it's funny you say that because I was just about to mention that she was supposed to originally be going on this trip with a few friends. However, for some reason or another, the friends were unable to attend, and it seemed like the plans just didn't pan out. So even though the trip with others didn't come to fruition, Louise decided that she was still going to make the most of it and take this mini vacay by herself to spend some time alone in the wilderness and do something she loved.
See, I'm like the total opposite of that. I plan something. The second other people back out, I'm like, all right, guess I can't do it.
Yeah, like when we were going to have that fire at our house a couple weeks ago and like literally everybody ditched and we were like, okay, we're going to hang out inside in our pajamas and eat ice cream and watch TV.
Pretty much.
Yeah, I'm the exact same way. But
especially on like a hiking thing, which is like semi-dangerous.
Yeah, definitely. I mean,
strange to go alone.
Well, but that's the thing. She was an avid hiker. This was something she did all the time. I had seen it reported that she'd even been to this region and this location before. She loved the White Mountains, so it seemed to be something that wasn't out of the ordinary for her.
All right, that's fair. I just can't put myself in her shoes and think that I would go hiking by myself.
Oh, I completely agree. I wouldn't either.
It's not as fun without somebody else.
This is true, but some people...
Want that alone time?
Well, yeah, but some people, like, thrive in that kind of environment. Like, for me, I could never go out and have dinner or lunch or something by myself. I'm not that type of person. I thrive in that social interaction in public. And then I come back home and I'm like an introvert for a week because I've had too much social interaction. That's how I am. But
yeah.
Now, the drive from Sherbrooke down to the Joe Dodge Lodge in the White Mountains should have taken Louise roughly 2 hours and 45 minutes, assuming there was no crazy traffic and also considering crossing the border into the United States. I'm not exactly sure what time she left her house, but it does seem as though, just based on when it's reported that she reached the border, which was said to be 11:45 a.m., that she probably would have left Sherbrooke sometime around 10:30 in the morning. The distance from Sherbrooke to the border in Norton, Vermont, where it said Louise had crossed into the U.S., was roughly 31 miles or 50 kilometers, which amounted to about a 50-minute drive. Again, considering traffic, this could have been a bit different, but I think it's relatively safe to say she probably left around 10 o'clock that morning. Once Louise crossed the border into the States, she was reported to have stopped at a Pick Quick gas station/convenience store to fill up her tank at around 12:50 p.m. The gas station she made this stop at was located in Colebrook, New Hampshire. The location of said gas station was about 58 miles, 93 kilometers, or about an hour and 15-minute drive from her destination. It was confirmed that she'd been at this location and did fill up her tank due to a credit card receipt later found in her vehicle. Now, from there, it's reported that she arrived at the Pinkham Notch Visitor Center and the Joe Dodge Lodge sometime around 3 p.m. that afternoon on the 15th. Then, from there, it's reported that roughly around this same 3 p.m. time frame, she spoke with an individual working at the Pinkham Notch Visitor Center and asked them what the best trail was that she could take that would be a short enough hike so she could complete it before the sun began to set that night. And remember, it is November in New Hampshire, so considering daylight savings time, you're probably thinking the sun would be setting relatively early, which, after a quick Google search, I was able to confirm the sun did set at approximately 4:17 p.m. on November 15th, 2001, as daylight savings time had already passed that year, and clocks were pushed back an hour back on October 28th in 2001.
Yeah, I was going to say, if she's there at 3:15-ish, asking this question, it doesn't leave her much time to start hiking.
Not at all. It's like an hour.
At most, probably.
Yeah, honestly.
Because you still got to pack your stuff up, you got to get to the location, and you got to go.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's probably why she asked the clerk to be like, is there something close by? Is there something short enough that I can even do today? Who knows if she hit traffic or what happened? I mean, if she left around 10 o'clock in the morning, it shouldn't have been like that long of a drive. It was probably about 3 hours. So you have to assume with crossing the border, filling up gas, all of that, it probably took a little bit extra time. But
yeah, well, I mean, she's at the Joe Dodge Lodge at 3:15. You got to assume that the trails are somewhat in that area. The time it took her to actually get to this point doesn't really matter that much.
No, but I'm just saying it in terms of she probably wanted to hike and she was just running out of daylight at that point. If she had gotten there earlier, she could have maybe taken a longer hike.
Right, makes sense.
That clerk that Louise was said to have spoken to at the visitor center had suggested a trail known as the Lost Pond Trail, which, mind you, this trailhead to start the hike was said to be literally right across the street from the visitor center. I did look up the Lost Pond Trail online, and when I did, a few different things came up. First of all, Google was recognizing the trail as the Square Ledge Trailhead, so I'm not exactly sure if the name of the trail may have changed over the past 20 years, but then second, when looking up the Lost Pond Trail on alltrails.com, it shows that it's in the exact same spot as this Square Ledge Trailhead that Google was showing me, so I can only assume they're one and the same or pretty much right next to each other. I'm not a hiking aficionado, so I apologize if that's not entirely accurate.
Lost Pond Trail could have been like the colloquial term that people that are in the know call it.
Yeah.
And maybe that's why on all trails, that's what it was referred to. But then when you look it on Google, it's something else.
Yeah, you should have seen me like trying to figure this out. I don't think I've been hiking a day in my life. So I was like, what does this mean? Where is this trailhead? Like, this intersects with what? Just so lost, but I did my best. I did also want to mention that on this All Trails website, it describes that this particular hike should have only taken about 45 minutes to complete, and it seemed to be a pretty easy hike. So considering the fact that the trailhead was right across the street from the visitor center, it seemed like a pretty convenient option for Louise, as obviously she was trying not to waste precious daylight at this point. After this, though, it's reported that Louise was not seen again, and she did not check into the lodge where she was supposed to be staying for the next few days.
So she hadn't already checked into the Joe Dodge Lodge?
No, I think that probably would have been too much of a waste of time at that point. Like, if she wants to get a hike in, she hopped into the visitor center and was like, where can I go?
Yeah.
So, yeah. Then a couple of days went by, and no one really knew anything about where Louise was, what she was doing, nothing. But I mean, this was a solo trip, so, you know. And I also have a feeling that the employees at the lodge wouldn't have been overly concerned.
I could see them trying to contact her to say, hey, are you coming in? Otherwise, your room's going to be forfeit, because if she was staying for like a 3-night stay,
yeah,
and then they were full and they wanted to use her room for something else, I'm sure she might forfeit the room after a certain point. So, yeah, I mean, I guess if they tried to contact her and they couldn't get in touch, that's probably the extent of their worry.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was trying to get at. Nobody that is close to Louise would know at that point, because why would the hotel have alerted anybody?
Right.
Or the lodge, whatever it's called.
Unless they had tried to contact her at like a home phone or something, when home phones were obviously
yeah,
more of a thing back
2001
then.
more of a thing, but I'm not sure. So
also, you'd be trying to call a Canadian number.
This is true, yeah.
Which may be difficult because some numbers in other countries are friggin' weird.
Yes, definitely. I was just recently listening to Your Own Backyard, and he called someone, I think he was in Norway or something, and he said, I literally received the longest phone number I've ever seen in my life. Okay, so after Louise didn't check in, the weekend then goes by, and then Monday, November 19th comes, and Louise didn't show up for work, and she didn't come home either, which obviously was incredibly concerning, and her boyfriend Pierre was super worried about her, and he called New Hampshire authorities from their home in Sherbrooke, Canada, to report her missing. Now, the next day, November 20th, 2001, I believe is when the search for Louise began. I don't know if investigators really knew exactly where they should have started their search in this area, though. I also don't know how much information Pierre gave to authorities, or if they even knew what visitor center or trailhead she was even supposed to be at. From what I can tell, Louise did not have any sort of itinerary or designated plan for where she'd be starting her hikes, or really her plans for the next few days, outside of knowing she was going to be staying at the Joe Dodge Lodge. But again, I don't know if investigators in the beginning anyway even knew that. So authorities likely just started searching as best they could and kind of spanned out from there. From what I can tell, the search itself was coordinated by the New Hampshire Fish and Game officers in the area, which I found to be interesting that it wasn't left up to state police or the town PD, but if I had to guess, it's most likely because this is a national forest?
Yeah, probably. There are parks around us that DEM almost holds jurisdiction over.
Okay.
Obviously, it's within a town, so a town can go in there as well. It's within a state, so a state can go in there as well.
Yep.
But I think when you start talking about, you know, a state park, like where you can go boating and stuff like that,
yep,
that's when you start getting into like fish and game and things. You can go fishing there. You can do boating there.
Yeah.
You can go
I mean, they're
hiking
like police,
on trails there.
Right? They have
the same powers as police.
Yeah.
So I would assume that it's fish and game because your regular police are not out, you know,
patrolling that
roaming
area.
these trails. Right. You're going to go to
true.
DEM, or you're going to go to, like, in this case, New Hampshire Fish and Game, because they're going to have ATVs. They're going to have all the equipment. They're going to know these trails.
True.
Which is why they're like the go-to source of information for trying to find this lady.
Yeah, that makes more sense then. They probably know the area. So it's like if you bring in state police or town police and you're like, hey, find her, they're going to be like, okay, Fish and Game, we need your help anyway because we don't know what we're looking at.
Right. State police is going to be like, hey, where's the highway? And then town police probably aren't out on these trails anyway. So.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Makes sense. So it's reported that dozens of searchers were scouring the area for any sign of Louise. And depending on where these searches were taking place within the White Mountains, the weather seemed to have an impact on things. Obviously, higher elevations were colder and had more snow on the ground, and lower elevations were more mild in terms of temperature and, of course, the amount of snowfall. I did see it reported, though, that at least one day of the search where I believe it was more focused in these higher elevations, that it got down to 16 degrees below freezing, which is just insane to imagine, not only for the searchers, but also potentially Louise being out there. Also, during the search, along with the individuals looking on foot, there was an Army National Guard helicopter used to survey the area from above.
So do we know if during this time it had snowed in the area?
So I don't believe that it snowed where she came into the visitor center, all of this, but just based on a couple early articles on this case, they had mentioned.
As you trekked up the mountain?
Yes. So as you're getting up to those higher elevations, obviously, like I said before too, I don't think they were entirely sure of where they should be searching. Did they even know that she went to this Pinkham Notch Visitor Center? Did they know she was staying at the Joe Dodge Lodge? They might not have, so they could have been starting from really anywhere.
That makes sense. I would hope that, if it seemed as though the Joe Dodge Lodge and the Pinkham Center were in the same general area.
They were. They're pretty much within the same plaza, I guess you would call it.
Okay, so you knew that she was going to the Joe Dodge Lodge, so you would go and look there. If her vehicle's not there, you would look in the general vicinity. You know that she's going hiking. She's probably going to check in at the visitor center.
Yep.
So then you find her vehicle there. You say, okay, here's a picture of this lady. Talk to all the employees. Did any of you see this lady? Did any of you give her guidance on where she could go for a hike? And kind of start from there?
Yeah.
But that's like best case scenario.
Yes, it seems like that would be what you would assume authorities would do first. But as we work through how the search worked out and when things were found and where things were found, you may have a little bit different of an opinion on that. So let's kind of work through that and then we can almost circle back to this a little bit.
All right.
Now, about a day into the search, on the 21st of November, Louise's car was located, and it was found in a parking lot labeled as being near the Diratissima Trail, which at first I thought was odd because I thought she was going to be hiking the Lost Pond Trail. Well, after some digging, I discovered that the Diratissima Trail's parking lot was right across the street from the Lost Pond Trailhead, and also on the same side of the road just south of this Pinkham Notch Visitor Center. And I also wanted to mention this really great website I stumbled across while I was trying to nail down the trailheads and where Louise's car was located and all that. And the site is called outdoorprojects.com, and they have a really nice comprehensive map of the area that has all the trailheads labeled appropriately, so it put things more into perspective visually, at least. Once Louise's car was found, authorities discovered a couple of things. First of all, it was mentioned that some of her hiking equipment had been taken with her, which I at first assumed to mean that she probably only brought the bare minimum with her because she was taking this quick, probably less than 1 hour hike. Authorities also stated that they found food left in her car. But again, I don't think that's totally out of the ordinary either. If she'd just been planning to take this short hike, then why would she bring food? I would assume that, she would probably take food with her if she were going for like a 6 or 7 hour long hike for sustenance, not an hour long hike, but.
Yeah, I agree with you as far as there's no need to bring food on this hour long hike. I would think maybe she had food on her to eat snacks as she's traveling from Canada down to New Hampshire.
Yeah, probably.
But nothing stands out to me as far as what seems to be in the car at this point.
Yeah, agreed.
Like heavy duty hiking equipment or food and rations that you would normally bring on a day-long hike.
Yep.
If that's what's left in there, that makes sense. I mean, she was just trying to get an hour-long hike in before she goes and checks into the lodge.
Yep. After an additional day of searching, on November 22nd, 2001, Thanksgiving Day here in the States, at around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, authorities found Louise Chaput's body. When her body was discovered, she was reported to have been wearing white Reebok sneakers, which certainly is odd considering the potential for snow in the area, and you would think as an avid hiker she would have been wearing hiking boots. But it was also stated that she had on a red jacket and black fleece pants. She was also said to be wearing a, quote, herringbone-style sterling silver necklace, end quote. Now, Louise's death was very quickly ruled a homicide, and it was stated that she had been stabbed to death. And in terms of where her body was found, it was mentioned that it was located relatively nearby to where her car had been parked near that Diratissima trailhead. It was later confirmed that her body was found off the Glen Boulder Trail, which is roughly a half mile to a mile south of this parking lot where her car was found. According to that Outdoor Projects website, quote, at 0.4 miles, the Glen Boulder Trail intersects the 1 mile Diratissima Trail, which connects to this visitor center and can be used if parking is scarce, end quote. So basically, what I'm trying to get at is that her body was found relatively close to where she was last seen near the visitor center, where her car was found, and the trailhead where she was supposed to be going hiking that afternoon.
So all of these things are adding up.
Mm-hmm.
Her car is where it's supposed to be.
Mm-hmm.
The stuff that's in the car isn't necessarily out of place. And she was found where she was supposed to be going.
Nearby to it. She's technically across the street. So the Lost Pond Trail was across the street from the visitor center. But
she went to the Deratissima Trail, which...
That had the parking. So I think she parked there to walk across the street maybe to start at that trailhead, because I don't think every trailhead had a parking lot.
Okay.
So then you think she probably parked at the Deratissima Trailhead, and then her body was found like anywhere between a quarter mile and a mile, I think, depending on how it was reported. But it was found on the Glen Boulder Trail. So I was like, how does this make sense?
But the Deratissima intersects with the Glen Boulder.
Exactly.
And those both may intersect with the Lost Pond?
They're in the same general vicinity of each other, but let's continue on. There's more you need to know.
Okay.
So something else reported about the area where Louise's body was found was that it was covered with leaves and also had a lot of cliffs. My first thought on why that was being explained in general is that it probably has to do with the reasoning as to why Louise's body hadn't been found sooner. I mean, they were out there searching for several days before they found her body, and they found her car the day prior, but her body was not far from where her car had been located. I will say, though, another thing that was mentioned was that her body was not actually on the trail. It was roughly 100 to 200 yards off of this Glen Boulder Trail, so if searchers were just sticking to the trails at first, then I guess this could also be another reason as to why her body wasn't discovered for a few days.
Yeah, I mean, if they're out there scouring the trails at first, and you're saying it's 100 to 200 yards off the trail, we're talking 2 football fields off the trail, down the bottom of a cliff area maybe, like tucked away.
So you're saying that 100 to 200 yards is like a football field length?
100 yards is the length of a football field.
Well, shit.
So,
I did not realize how far that was.
Right. So for reference, 100 feet is like telephone pole to telephone pole.
Okay.
100 yards would be from the beginning of one end zone to the beginning of the other end zone of a football field.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. So that is a significant distance then.
Yeah. I mean, we're talking the length of 3 telephone poles or 6 telephone poles.
Yeah, okay, wow, that's a lot.
Yeah.
So I can totally see why her body hadn't been found at first and kind of probably just giving reasons to the media to say, this is why it may have taken longer. We don't want people to think that we weren't doing our jobs, that kind of thing.
Right. Originally, you're going to go through and you're going to start on the trails. Because maybe she got injured on the trail and she's stuck there.
Yep.
Then you start branching out off the trail and probably some type of grid pattern to try and find her.
Yeah, and I bet once they found her car the day before, they were most likely centered in this particular area and branched out from there.
You got it.
Okay. So now, within the first couple of days after Louise's body had been found, authorities made the public aware that a woman had been murdered in the White Mountains, and over the next few weeks and months, some press conferences were given, as well as additional comments to the media in terms of authorities' investigation at this stage. First and foremost, there was no confirmation on a motive or murder weapon, and it was unclear if Louise was specifically targeted or if this could have been a stranger or random attack. However, authorities in New Hampshire did say they were working with Canadian authorities to retrace Louise's steps to try and get an idea of what the whole timeline here was, which I actually already gave you the full timeline earlier. Over time, they do confirm each piece, including her arrival time in the United States, the gas station stop, as well as the conversation she had with the clerk. But I wanted to give that to you up front rather than kind of following the typical flow of the episodes where I give you little tidbits, kind of in the same way you would have found out about them if you were following the case in real time. But regardless of all that, I did see it mentioned that the clerk wasn't exactly 100% sure that it was Louise that they'd talked to, but based on all the information, it seemed pretty concrete to me that at least in investigators' minds, they did believe it was Louise that this clerk spoke to. Now, something authorities were telling the public was obviously to be vigilant. There was just a woman hiking alone in what was believed to be a relatively safe place, and she'd been killed, so the usual warnings that one might expect were given to the public. The biggest things that authorities and the assistant AG were asking the media to portray were to use the buddy system and be cautious. The Valley News reported what the Assistant Attorney General at the time said regarding being safe while hiking. She stated, quote, "Hikers should travel with a companion, register at trailheads, check weather conditions, and leave an itinerary," end quote. Well, a few individuals who were hiking in this same area where Louise had been killed were actually interviewed for several publications, and the sentiment seemed to be one of two things. One, people were definitely worried, but two, that wasn't going to stop them from doing something they loved. One hiker who was interviewed for an Associated Press article in the Valley News stated, quote, "It was probably some wacko, right? I'm not going to go somewhere else. This is where I always go," end quote. And this comment was in terms of this hiker changing up which trailhead they'd go to, because when interviewed, they were in the Glen Boulder area, which was the trail where Louise's body was found somewhat off of. Another individual that was interviewed for the Concord Monitor stated, quote, "I'm freaked out. How could a person staring at this gift, looking around at nature, do something like this? But it's not going to stop me from being in the woods," end quote. So yeah, it seems like that's the common thing here. Yes, people were nervous, but they weren't going to stop doing something they enjoyed.
Yeah, some people you can't, not beat sense into, but
yeah,
when they have a love of a hobby, you can't change their mind. I work with a guy that a couple years ago, when there were all these shark sightings and attacks off the Cape, he was still going to the beach and swimming, and his significant other has a picture of him in the water with a freaking fin behind him.
You're kidding.
A shark fin.
You're joking. Wow.
So, I mean, some people just want to do what they want to do. And
yeah, that's a good example, too. It's not just necessarily hiking or whatever. There could be anything that there could be this potential danger, and people are like, no,
right. And
I love this, and I'm going to do it.
Right, and it's not even a potential danger of the activity itself, because there are inherent dangers of hiking. You can become injured, you can accidentally fall off a cliff, an animal can attack you or stuff like that. But outside of those regular dangers that you know that you're facing, you now have potentially a crazy maniac stabbing people to death in the woods.
Seriously.
And you're like, yeah, no, I'm still going to come here.
Yeah. And I mean, one of those women I'm pretty sure had a dog with her, so maybe she felt a little bit more confident to say, oh, I have my dog with me.
I guess.
Get him, but
still.
Something that I gathered from these public statements, though, is that it didn't really seem like authorities were really alerting the public that they needed to be worried about this potential killer on the loose, which kind of made me think that they didn't believe anyone was in any sort of real danger. Because if that were believed to be true, wouldn't you think they'd say, be super vigilant, there is a killer on the loose, you could be the next victim?
Right, you would hope so, unless they're privy to information that we don't yet know.
Yeah, but I would feel like then all these other people hiking in the area, if something happened to them, you would have wanted to know. I feel like that's a lawsuit waiting to happen to say you didn't warn us that there was a killer that we needed to be worried about.
Well, I mean, if they come out and they say, hey, a lady was just stabbed in the woods off one of these trails, do you really have to have your hand held to realize that they never said that the killer was caught?
True, yeah. I just think if there were a serious danger, you see so many times, for example, with Geraldine and Jack McGee, where they said, obviously, they were killed, it was in this area, but it was an isolated incident. You have nothing to be worried about. Still, there wasn't a killer that was caught, but they're still saying it's isolated. I didn't see them say anything about this being a one-time isolated incident.
Sure. That's what I'm saying. Maybe they're privy to information that we don't yet know. And I'm wondering if they believe that it's an isolated incident, and that's why they're not, causing panic.
Okay.
Or maybe they're trying to avoid panic.
Yeah.
Side note, I also think it's strange that authorities are allowing people to continue hiking this area. You would think that this would be shut down as they're searching for evidence.
Yeah, I mean, it was over time. It's not within a day or two, but
I'm sure it's under surveillance at least. I'm sure there's more of a police presence in the area or fish and game in the area. Keeping an eye out, that way if something were to happen, they're there with a quick response.
Yes, and I would also assume probably crime scene tape, probably authorities spending time in that area to make sure people aren't trampling all over a crime scene, taking in all of their evidence that they need, all of that. I would assume they're not going to let people just walk over there.
And it is far off the trail, like we said, so maybe that doesn't even matter. People can still hike the trail, and if they're 2 football fields away,
it's not going to affect the crime scene. Yeah.
Right.
So we've kind of been talking about the national forest, potential dangers, things like that. But there was something that I learned while researching this case in terms of the potential danger of coming across a killer in this specific environment and during this specific time frame. And that was that murders in national forests, especially the Appalachian Trail, apparently were not as common as one might expect. So, First of all, it was apparently very uncommon and odd that this murder took place in this area of the White Mountains in 2001 because of something the executive director of Fish and Game at the time told the Concord Monitor. He'd mentioned that he couldn't remember another murder on Mount Washington, which is a part of the White Mountains, for at least the last 30 years. And the murder this guy was talking about was that of a woman named Sherry Roth, who'd been strangled to death and her body left in the White Mountains back in 1977. Not quite 30 years, but close.
And this is a highly frequented area for tourists.
Yes.
How many cars have you seen with a bumper sticker saying, "This car climbed Mount Washington"?
So many.
Do you know of the man in the mountain?
I do not.
Okay, my sister had a project back in, I think, like elementary school where she had to make something out of like clay or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
There's a mountain that I don't know if it still looks like this because I'm sure like with erosion and shit it may have changed, but there was a big cliff or rock face that looked like a man's face in the mountain.
Interesting.
I'm pretty sure that was in the White Mountains.
Did she make it with paper mache?
I think she might have made it with paper mache and then some type of clay that she put on it. We'll have to ask her later.
I would be very interested to play with paper mache again. I don't think I've done that in like 25 years.
But yeah, I mean, this is like a tourist area.
Yeah.
So there'd be a lot of people there. So strange that, I mean, obviously we know that it was around sundown that this occurred.
Yep.
But you'd think that there's probably people heading on the trail back to their cars at this point.
Mm-hmm.
Highly trafficked area, which is probably another reason why this representative had said, "Oh, I can't remember a murder happening here for 30 years.
Yeah. But back to what I was saying before. So the statistics back in 2001, mind you, this is not today. I don't know exactly how the numbers are today, but in 2001, the statistics showed that national forests were actually pretty safe in terms of the risk of murder, which was just crazy to me because just last week in our episode on Judy Smith, it seemed to me like national forest murders were more common than I would have expected, but the numbers just didn't show that back in 2001 and honestly back in 1997 when that case took place.
Well, I guess in New Hampshire, it's a place for tourists to go and to hike these trails, whereas in North Carolina, it's a place for hippies and cults to hang out and kill
Apparently, according to that local, yeah.
Right.
Rob Burbank, who is a part of the Appalachian Mountain Club, stated, quote, "500,000 people hike in the White Mountain National Forest every year. Statistically, the forest and trails are a very safe place to be," end quote. Overall, the common view on this was that weather is what hikers should be most concerned about while spending time in the mountains. According to a piece in the Concord Monitor, only 9 people had been murdered on the Appalachian Trail since 1974, and the Appalachian Trail literally spans all the way from Georgia to Maine. But also, this is just an odd coincidence because, again, to go back to last week's case, I'm covering 2 cases that murders occurred in a national forest. They must be 2 of the 9.
Right.
Because they took place within that time frame. But the thing that's just weird, though, and I think that might make people think a little bit differently and made me think that national forest murders were more common, is like there are podcasts strictly dedicated to national forest murders. So you think that there's probably so many more, but of course there are extenuating circumstances, things like that. But today the numbers are a little bit more inflated. But back in 2001, this was considered a safe place to be. And I'm sure Louise didn't think anything of it. I'm sure, again, these hikers afterwards were thinking this is probably an isolated incident. This just doesn't happen around here.
Yeah, the only thing I would say is like back in 1970 to 2001 time frame, people could have been on that trail that nobody ever knew that they were on the trail and they could have ended up murdered.
Yes. Yeah. So it's like ones that
we know 9 that occurred, but more could have happened.
That were reported, that were found, things like that. So, of course, there definitely could be more. But I just thought that was interesting because that probably goes along with the mindset back then as well of people thinking, like you mentioned in the very beginning of the episode, I would never go hiking by myself. But for Louise, she probably was thinking, this is normal. People do it all the time. Yep. That was the common thought process back then.
Yeah, it could have been like a workout type thing.
Yeah. 20 years ago was a long time. Even though it seems like 1990 was yesterday.
10 years ago.
Yeah. But anyway, moving on. Another interesting tidbit of information about the area where Louise was killed is that I guess there had been a lot of burglaries and robberies in recent years. And something that John actually helped me to understand when I was researching this case is that there is actually a difference between a burglary and a robbery. I know, totally naive of me, but according to an article in U.S. News, quote, "Robbery is taking something through force or fear. Burglary is breaking in with intent to commit a theft or felony and has the potential for violence, end quote. Well, due to the theft and crime in the area, authorities were attempting to reduce those high numbers with additional surveillance and patrolling, but of course, a national forest area is a lot of ground to cover, so that had to be difficult. One woman who was interviewed for the Concord Monitor stated, quote, "When you leave my town and enter Pinkham's Grant, there's nobody up there patrolling. The state police have a big area, and they're spread pretty thin," end quote.
Yeah, and state police are generally patrolling the highway areas, unless they're being called in to assist local police, like towns and cities.
Mm-hmm.
Then you have DEM and Fish and Game, taking on the burden of
the massive,
all the wildlife areas in New Hampshire.
I can only imagine how many DEM or Fish and Game officers they must have had.
Not enough.
No, there's no way you could ever have enough.
Generally, I would think that the trails are a place that are safer from these burglaries and robberies.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, you don't have a building or a home or a business to break into outside of maybe like the trailheads or the lodges. And then robbery, it's like people that are going to hike a trail aren't keeping expensive jewelry and money on them.
Mm-hmm.
So,
well, you have to think, though, they're cars. You always see when you go into a mall parking lot.
Breaking a window and taking property from there.
Yeah, well, there's always those signs up that say, secure your property, bring it with you, things like that. So I can only imagine it's probably similar in an area like this where during busy seasons, you probably have a lot of cars. And if people are taking day-long hikes, that's good for burglars or robbers to come and try and steal their stuff.
Very true.
So, okay, so now that you have all that information under your belt regarding statistics and the crimes kind of going on in the area around that time, let's move back into the investigation into Louise's murder. First of all, after Louise's body was found, the New Hampshire State Police Major Crime Unit became involved in the investigation. Authorities working the case were looking into a couple different ideas revolving around who could have done this and why. As I mentioned earlier on, police in New Hampshire were going to be working with Canadian authorities, and one of the things they wanted to try and iron out was if Louise could have potentially been followed from Canada into the United States. Another lingering question at this point had to do with why this person chose to attack Louise at this time, and the line of thinking had to do with the fact that November was the off-season in the White Mountains, so there would be far less people hiking in the area. So that could lead you to believe that Louise could have been attacked at this time, was potentially chosen at random, but the perpetrator was in the area because they knew there would be less people around. However, come to find out, based on an article in the Concord Monitor, it was actually oddly busier than usual due to nicer and more mild weather. Yet it also says that after Louise's murder, things slowed down substantially, most likely due to weather, yet again, as it was reported that the temperatures dropped quite a bit in the following weeks, and I'm sure, like we've talked about a couple times already, people were worried after hearing a woman had been killed along these trails. Even though some stayed around, maybe some tourists didn't come down. There were also comments in the media about how authorities pretty much weren't releasing any other important details of the case at this time. Some examples given were if there was a struggle or how long Louise had been deceased before her body was located. It's also unclear if she was killed in the area or not, but I think just based on what we know so far, especially considering where her car was found, her conversation with this visitor center employee, she likely wasn't brought there from somewhere else. At least that's just my opinion on it.
It seems to make the most sense that she was murdered in the area where her body was found.
Yeah, everything was just so close by.
Now, I kind of mentioned this before.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe they're privy to information that we don't yet know. But it seems as though they have a general idea of where they're trying to go with this investigation.
Yes, it seemed that way. At this point, even though certain details of the crime, like I mentioned, if there was a struggle, how long she had been deceased, anything about a murder weapon and motive, none of those big things were being released. Authorities were asking the public for a couple things, and those were in terms of assistance. So there were a few things investigators wanted to hear from potential witnesses about. One, we had talked about how Louise had stopped at that gas station before she made her way to the visitor center, and investigators wanted anyone that may have seen her there to come forward. And two, information regarding items that should have been with Louise but were not found with her was released. It was mentioned that the following items were not with her, and investigators were hoping the public may have seen them, found them, or knew anything about them, and obviously wanted anyone with info to come forward. It's reported that the following items were missing. 1. a blue backpack described more specifically as a dark blue internal frame backpack that may have had leather straps. 2, a green Canuck sleeping bag that could have been inside said blue backpack or potentially hooked onto the outside of it. And 3, her car keys. The keys, I think, would be pretty identifiable, knowing the make and model of her car, the fact that it was stated that there was the physical key to, put into the slot on the car door, but also a remote door opener was attached, and there was also an S pendant, like the letter S, on the key ring. And finally, authorities wanted the public to know that even if they didn't think whatever they saw or may have heard or even knew wasn't important, that they should come forward with the information anyway. Which I think this is a pretty common thing we hear authorities asking of the public in basically every case we cover, but I think it's a good reminder to anyone who may know something. It really could be that little tidbit that breaks a case wide open.
So these should have been with her, but they weren't. These items, I'm assuming, should have been in the car or on her person.
Well, why would she leave her keys in the car?
Some of the items I should have said. Because why would she bring a sleeping bag?
I think it might have just been how everything was attached.
Everything was attached to the bag?
Yeah, so if she had her backpack, say...
I understand, the framed thing.
Yep.
The metal frames that help carry,
Make
heavier...
it easier to hold, yeah.
Right. So, I don't know, my first instinct of why these items were missing, I would assume if the sleeping bag is attached to the backpack and it's all one unit that she's carrying, and this person killed her, and then now these items are missing, let's assume that they were all together. So if this person took one thing, they took all of them.
Something that I thought was just weird was the keys, but you make a good point saying that they could have been in the backpack. For me, at first, when I was researching this case, I thought, why would you take her keys to not take her car? Especially if you're considering any potential theft that was happening in the area. If they have the keys readily available, why wouldn't they take the car? Maybe they just didn't know?
They could have, or maybe they had taken the backpack and the sleeping bag, and as they were making their way back on the trail to the vehicle, maybe there were too many people around at that time and they didn't feel comfortable taking the car.
Maybe. That's a good point, too.
If you take the car, then that's a big red flag.
They'd probably be looking
to
for
see,
the car.
if you start driving this car and you get pulled over or you get into an accident, these are more people seeing you with a now dead woman's property.
Yeah.
Whereas if you have, just a backpack and a sleeping bag and all that stuff together, you're on a hiking trail. It's not out of the ordinary to be wearing those things.
Yeah, nope, that makes perfect sense. So after all of this information was released, there was pretty much nothing else reported on in this case for roughly another 3 years until the 3rd anniversary of Louise's murder in November of 2004. Several of her family members and friends visited the area in New Hampshire where she was killed to try and keep her case in the public eye. Her daughters would usually come down on the anniversaries, but for this particular anniversary, I believe it was her daughter Corinne who traveled down, and then 2 of her friends, Dennis Masson and Marie Pinot, who were a married couple that Louise was very close with, and it's reported that she'd at least been friends with Marie since 1986.
Where's Pierre?
I'm not sure. I really don't know. I haven't seen much about him reported in this case.
I mean, he was a boyfriend for 14 years?
It seemed that way, yeah.
Because if they met when her oldest daughter was 5...
For all I know, he might not have wanted to be on camera or anything like that. Seems as though friends and family came down regularly, at least on the anniversaries, to remember her and all of that. And for all I know, it was just these 3 people who were interviewed by news stations, and maybe he wasn't. But
sure. I was just asking because, as we often do, significant other, state police were talking to Canadian police. Was she followed? Wondering if there was any connection there.
Yeah, no, it's a good question to ask, but unfortunately I really don't have any info on him. So now that Louise's friends and family, were coming down, it was around the 3rd year anniversary, they were feeling frustrated because, of course, they wanted answers. It had been 3 years. They, at this point, had nothing. They knew nothing of who could have done this to their friend, their mother, their loved one. Obviously, they wanted her killer to be apprehended, but not only for justice and closure for them, but they wanted to make sure this monster couldn't hurt someone else, which I feel is something we don't talk about too often. The whole point of talking about these cases and getting them out in the world and in the public eye is to help loved ones find closure, of course, but also it's just as important to get these killers off the street so they can't hurt someone else. Literally, this potentially opportunistic stranger killer is just roaming around free as a bird with no consequences. One of her friends, Dennis, told the Conway Daily Sun, quote, "It's important to us to stop this person, and that person is put away so this doesn't happen again. It would be great to have closure for us, but it wouldn't bring back Louise," end quote. I just really liked that her family and friends had mentioned that they obviously want answers for their friend, but they want to ensure the public is safe too, and I think that's admirable.
Yeah, I think so too. It shows that they're not just, narrow-minded on what's best for them and what they want for themselves, but also their loved one and friend and, like you said, mother was killed by this random person, stabbed to death. Which
Most
is a
likely
violent
random
killing.
person is what it seems like so far.
Right, and it's a violent killing, being stabbed to death, so the public is still at risk with this person on the loose.
Yeah, even if the police aren't saying, oh, there's this killer out here, you need to watch out on these trails in the Appalachian Mountains or whatever. Regardless, there is still somebody out there that took somebody else's life, and if they can do it once, they can do it again.
Right.
Okay, let's move on a little bit. So I gave you a lot of information up front, but it isn't until around this time in reporting on the case, around this 3-year anniversary, that the public learns of the 3 p.m. conversation Louise was said to have with that clerk at the visitor center. Also reported around this same time was that authorities were under the impression, at least based on what they'd gathered so far in this investigation, which seems to be info the public wasn't privy to, but it seems as though they did not believe that Louise was followed from Canada into New Hampshire.
Okay, that's fair. I think that would be difficult to do.
Yes.
Just because you're going through Border Patrol, you're going to get stuck at the border for a while.
Mm-hmm.
So if she was followed, could it have been somebody from the gas station where she filled up?
Exactly.
Something along those lines.
I feel like that's probably why authorities put out that message to the public to say, if you were at this gas station and you saw this woman, can you come forward? Because for all they know, maybe they saw something.
Right. Did you see this weird person hanging around that left the gas station, almost in pursuit of this female that left?
Mm-hmm.
Did you have any weird feelings about it?
Yep. Good questions to ask. Roughly 7 more years go by before anything else new is reported on. At this point, it seems as though friends and family have now made this New Hampshire trip a yearly thing, so they come every year to remember Louise, and they would meet with authorities and the media whenever they could come down to attempt to keep the case out there in the world and keep people talking about it. And I really don't know if this case would have been discussed or put in the media as much as it was if they hadn't been doing this. There were definitely some really long stretches of time where this case just was not reported on at all. But as of 2011, something big was mentioned in an article with the Valley News, and that's that authorities had a person of interest in the case. While this may seem like great news and answers could be around the corner, the article then mentions what Michael Kokoski of the New Hampshire Cold Case Unit stated about said person of interest. It says that he, quote, warned that there have been several such people over the years. He said some have been ruled out and others still have an investigative focus. End quote. It's also confirmed that the 3 p.m. conversation Louise had with the visitor center clerk was in fact the last confirmed sighting of her, and it seems as though authorities were unable to track down anyone else that had seen her, talked to her, or otherwise come across her before she was murdered. Also, the autopsy determination became more clear at this point as well. An article in the Valley News stated, quote, an autopsy later determined that she had been the victim of a homicide and had died of multiple stab and incised wounds, end quote. I do also want to mention, and mind you, I only saw this in one article, so I absolutely do not know how true it is, so don't take it as absolute fact. But there was one article that stated that Louise's throat had been cut. I'm going to try and connect this and explain how I think this could maybe be accurate, even though I haven't seen officials on the case confirm it. So bear with me here for a second, okay? The definition of an incised wound is a, quote, wound characterized by a clean cut as by a sharp instrument, rather than a laceration, which is more of a break or tearing of the skin caused by a blunt object, so like hitting someone incredibly hard with a blunt object and therefore breaking their skin. So then stab wounds would most likely be the knife going directly into the body, whereas I would assume an incised wound would be more along the lines of a cut with the edge of a blade, not the tip of a blade. Which then makes me think that a cut to her throat could totally be possible if you're considering that to be categorized as an incised wound. But again, I did only see this comment in one place on the internet, so I'm not totally positive on its accuracy.
Interesting. I've been referring to lacerations incorrectly my whole life then.
Really? Did I teach you something new?
Well, I mean, think about it. Say you're working in a kitchen and somebody cuts their finger with a knife.
Yeah.
Right? If you're calling 911, you would say, oh, this person has a large laceration to the finger.
Yeah.
I think a laceration could be a cut too, though.
Yeah, so a laceration can technically have two different definitions. It can be a deep cut or a tear in skin or flesh.
Okay.
So I don't know. I guess maybe you could kind of categorize it both ways. I wonder if it's like an autopsy term thing.
I feel like it must be an autopsy term type thing because I have always used the term laceration in regards to like injuries sustained from a knife.
Mm-hmm.
It does make you think, though, if they're saying, lacerations and incised wounds, there must be some differentiator with one or more of the injuries sustained during the murder.
Yeah, so I would think if they were determining cause of death, if they're saying it was both stab wounds and incised wounds, regardless, any which way you look at it, it's brutal.
Right, but it would be redundant to say lacerations and incised wounds.
Yes.
If they were both
referring
to the same thing.
Yes, good point.
I would say that it's like pretty out there for a publication to come forward and say her neck was cut or her throat was cut without having gotten that information from a source that maybe they shouldn't have been able to get it from.
Yeah, maybe someone spilled the beans when they shouldn't have and they released it, and whoever was a part of the police department maybe got their butt smacked for that one to say you should not have told this reporter that. So, and that's why I always try, and even if there are things that aren't totally corroborated by multiple other sources, there are things that could be important. If somebody is willing to kill someone in this way, this is, I would assume, a very violent person. This isn't just someone who accidentally, got into this fight with someone and just, say they were trying to steal her stuff and they just got into this altercation and maybe, they knocked her down and she hit her head and died that way. This is a violent attack. This is a violent person, in my opinion.
There is a question I'm left with that we'll get to later if you don't answer it.
Okay. Now, in terms of kind of where the investigation is today, authorities have stated that this hasn't been the easiest of investigations. Not that any of them are easy, but there were some things that were out of their control that made it a bit tougher to close the case. One of the biggest issues they cite is the fact that Louise lived and was employed in Canada, not the United States. And again, we'd talked before about how authorities don't believe she was followed from Canada to New Hampshire, but of course they say publicly they aren't totally ruling it out as an option, but it isn't at the top of their list either. Michael Kokoski, that detective with New Hampshire State Police Major Crimes Unit I mentioned before, told the Valley News, quote, "It seems more than likely that whoever is responsible for this is someone she encountered here," end quote. Another big issue is how long it had been since her body was found compared to when she was last seen. It had been an entire week in between. The fact that this was stated in this way at this time made me think we now have an answer as to when Louise was killed, which authorities had said they weren't going to release early on, but now, just based on this additional information and later reporting as well, authorities do believe she was killed a short time after she'd arrived at the Pinkham Notch Visitor Center. And in my mind, I would think it likely happened right after she'd parked and gotten to the trailhead.
Well, if she was followed by somebody, how easy would it be for someone to follow her from the center?
I mean, from the center? Yeah, probably.
What about, like, a trail guide?
I don't know if they had them. And you have to think with it being that late in the day, maybe they didn't take on new hikers after a certain hour.
Right. So they're free. They're not working anymore.
Okay, I just gave you a perfect answer to your question.
Right. And they would probably be well-versed in the area.
Mm-hmm.
If she was found, 300 to 600 feet off of the trail, they'd have to be relatively knowledgeable about what's around the trail in order to get her there and to get out of the area
without
before
being
somebody
seen
saw them.
Or
Just an idea.
Very good point. Not anything I was thinking about. I feel like I say that in every episode. There's always something that you come up with and I'm like, dang, I didn't think of it.
Well, I always think, where would this or how would this be an easy opportunity for someone?
Well, this seems like an opportunistic killing. Is that what you think?
I think it's an opportunistic killing, maybe not necessarily somebody that crossed paths with her on the trail, but maybe somebody that saw her go into the trail and then ended up following her to the trail.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking too.
Opportunistic in a sense, yes. I think that whoever did this planned to do it on the trail and followed her to there.
That makes sense.
Just feels that, like, that makes sense.
Yeah. There was also a comment in that same Valley News article from 2011 that did mention that authorities re-review physical evidence found at the scene relatively frequently to see if they could test it. It seems like they're curious about new testing capabilities because it was also stated that some of the physical evidence they review regularly did include DNA. I have no idea, though, what the DNA entails, whether it's blood, semen, sweat DNA, or anything like that, or what their sample size is like. Either way, though, having DNA is huge in a case like this, where it certainly could be just a random attack. I feel like we see detectives talk all the time about how those are the hardest to solve, because statistically speaking, most murders are perpetrated by someone close to the victim. Also, very interestingly, there was some additional buzz in the media in this case around 2014 when authorities were asking the public yet again to keep an eye out for those missing items of Louise's that hadn't been located. Remember, the backpack, sleeping bag, and her keys. I also discovered that the backpack apparently had what's been described as a, quote, Canadian insignia on it. I feel like that might mean the Canadian flag, but I'm not positive.
Maybe a maple leaf?
Could be, yeah. Also at this point, authorities yet again were asking the public to come forward with anything they may know about the case that could help them further their investigation and hopefully find Louise's killer. What the assistant AG said in 2014 regarding this plea to the public, I think rings true in most older cases. She stated, quote, somebody may have been in a relationship with an individual who said something or knows any little detail about what had happened to Louise, and those relationships haven't changed. They might be in a place where they can come forward now. We really hope that they do, end quote. And what I think that means, because I think there may have been a typo in the article, but I think she means if those relationships have changed over the past 2 decades, then maybe someone who no longer has an allegiance or possibly even a hold held over them by another person now might feel more comfortable coming forward to authorities with whatever it is they know.
Or maybe they had a person of interest who they interviewed that person's significant other, and maybe they now know that those two people are no longer together.
Ooh.
And they're like, hey, we know that you know more than what you told us back when we interviewed you before.
Yeah.
You're not with this person anymore. Why don't you come forward and tell us everything?
See, these are always things that I wonder if I'm being almost repetitive in a case where obviously they're pleading with the public in the beginning. They're pleading with the public on anniversaries. 2014 was kind of an obscure year. So I'm like, was this important? Of course it's important. It's all important. So I'm wondering, why are they saying this at this time and in this way? So it's always why I bring these things up, because you have such a good take on that, where that's not anything I would have thought of to say, why would they be saying this in 2014 so randomly to also plead to people who might have had like an allegiance or something like that? Clearly, that's a perfect example of why someone would potentially come forward in this random time frame.
Right. It could be as simple as some type of intimate relationship that two people were involved, and maybe one of them was a person of interest. Or it could have been back to the idea of maybe it being like a trail guide or somebody that worked around the center, something like that. There could have been a firing that occurred. Maybe they worked. Maybe they worked there for an extended period of time, and then something happened, and that person was fired. So allegiances don't necessarily have to mean like a love interest or a friend or something like that. It could also do with like employment and shit like that too. But I think that if they're coming forward and they're saying that, allegiances may have changed, there are certainly times where authorities know that allegiances have changed or that relationships have ended, and that's why they're coming forward saying that, because the person who potentially has more information may not want to come forward.
Yeah.
Maybe they had talked or confided in one of their friends before.
Yeah, and then once that's put out to the public, maybe a family member or friend, like you were saying, knows about it, and they can kind of almost put pressure on that person to say, hey, you know this.
That's what I was going for.
Okay, yeah. Also, between 2014 and 2021, there was some additional information released that I think is pretty huge in this case. So, for starters, we had talked before about some of the things left in Louise's car, like some of her hiking equipment and then some food. One thing mentioned about this was that she had 2 backpacks. The one investigators were looking for was just one of the 2 that she supposedly had with her. Also, in a more recent article on this case with WMUR, there's a passage that elaborates more on what was left in the car. It states, quote, They said the larger of 2 backpacks Chaput had with her was gone, but her hiking shoes, along with her water and chocolate, 2 things she always took hiking with her, were still in the car, end quote.
Interesting. I was going to say, well, maybe this other backpack that was in the car was like her luggage and had all of her clothes and stuff.
Yeah.
For her stay.
Possible, yeah.
But now to know that things that she specifically always took hiking with her were left in the car, that's sus.
Yes,
that means like maybe she was approached at her vehicle, forced into the woods.
Yes. So in the beginning, I gave you like a little nugget where I had commented about the fact that she was found wearing her white Reebok sneakers. You're an avid hiker, regardless of how long the hike is going to be. Hiking shoes are made a specific way for doing a specific thing. Why are you going to go in your sneakers in November? Who knows what the weather is like? Could you slip on a rock like in a pair of sneakers? You know what I mean? So for me, my initial thought on that was, why would she not put her hiking boots on? That doesn't make sense. The fact that she's in sneakers makes me think she did not even get to start her hike.
Yeah, I would say that makes sense. I mean, being an avid hiker like that, she would absolutely gear up appropriately.
Of course, even if it was a short hike, maybe she would have only brought 1 backpack.
Right, 1 backpack, but she would have put her shoes on.
She would have brought
taken
water.
Her water and her chocolate.
Yeah. Even if she didn't bring chocolate, at least water. I can't even live my life. I can't even drive in the car without my water.
Yeah, no, I hear you, but I think if those are things that like she always takes with her, that's strange.
And one devil's advocate thing I was thinking, which then I also devil's advocated that back at myself when I was thinking about this case, was, well, why wouldn't she just wear her hiking boots and not wear her sneakers? But then when we were playing pickleball the other night with one of the guys you work with, he had his Vans in the car, and I saw him get out of the car. I was like, is he wearing shoes? But he put on his more athletic shoes after. So people do that all the time where they bring the shoes they're going to wear for said activity versus wearing it there. So I devil's advocated my devil's advocate.
Yeah, and I think like hiking boots, you're going to lace them up tight. They're going to be much more rigid. If you're driving from Canada down to New Hampshire, I doubt you want to be wearing a stiff boot the whole time you're driving.
Yeah, exactly. So,
but it is strange. You would think that she would be wearing those when she left, even for only a 45-minute to an hour hike.
I agree completely. Some of the other things that were released were that investigators do believe that Louise was forced off the Glen Boulder Trail and brought to a clearing, assumably where her body was found roughly 100 yards away. They do believe this was a random attack and that Louise did not know the person who murdered her, and that Louise fought very hard for her life. I think that investigators believe this to be true because there was probably a struggle at the scene that must have indicated this, which also makes me wonder if maybe she had scratched her attacker and that's where they had the DNA from.
That was exactly what I was going to ask, and that was part of my questions we're left with portion, was what type of DNA is there if she did struggle.
And there was one other thing too, which I was just about to like spill the beans on myself, but investigators aren't sure whether the perpetrator took the items that they've been looking for all these years, the backpack, sleeping bag, all that, if they took them from Louise specifically, like snatched them from her after she had started her hike, or if they might have even stolen them directly from her car as she was getting ready for her hike.
Just because she was stabbed to death doesn't necessarily mean that that was how she was coerced and forced onto the trail.
Yes.
Somebody very well could have had a firearm on them, forced her out of the car, picked up her bag, thrown it over their shoulder, forced her out into the wilderness off the trail, and then, as opposed to shooting her to kill her, used a knife because much quieter.
Yep.
You're not going to attract attention as easily.
And if you're that close to the parking lot too, they're less than a mile from this parking lot.
Right.
So you have to consider they're also probably less than 2 miles from the visitor center. You're probably not looking at hunting. Like, can you even hunt in a national forest? I don't think you can.
I don't know. I'm sure there's designated areas.
Yeah.
But like with Jane Pritchard, people were hunting in this forest
yeah,
while
this
people
is
were out
true.
doing science experiments.
Also true. Different state, but still.
Yeah. I don't know. I think that with all the information we have now, the thing that makes the most sense is that she was coerced and forced into the forest from her vehicle. But where did this person come from, and why did they target her is the question.
Okay, so at the end of the day, I think all of this information we recently learned is huge. I think it's kind of probably changed everything that you thought about the case. I know once I learned all of it, I was of this particular mindset. So it brings me to a theory in this case. And this is where I land here for this case. So I'm going to lay it out for you. So I think this could have been an attempted robbery gone wrong, or it was a robbery with the intent to cause harm to another. Just the fact that she wasn't wearing her hiking boots, the water and chocolate being left in the car, the items being taken from her like her backpack and her sleeping bag, the fact that she's found less than a half mile from where her car was parked. I mean, what other theory fits here? Someone's trying to specifically steal something from her. I don't know if her car of the time, like maybe it was a newer car. It was a 2001 silver Ford Focus. It was 2001, so it's a brand new car at the time. Maybe they thought she had money, something along those lines. But I think at the end of the day, she's ambushed by a stranger. I think they had intent for robbery, especially considering if they had robberies and theft and stuff like that being an issue back then. I don't think she was followed. I see what you're saying regarding maybe someone at a gas station, maybe one of the trail workers or whatever, but I think she was unfortunately in the wrong place at the wrong time. She had literally just gotten here, and that's where I land.
I don't know if I'm totally on board with that. I do think it was an opportunistic attack.
Mm-hmm.
As far as like a robbery goes, all it seems that this suspect took was her backpack and sleeping bag and whatever contents were in there.
Mm-hmm. But maybe it just went bad. That's what I'm saying.
Right. It definitely could have went bad, but I don't know if if somebody was just trying to rob her, they would flash their weapon and they would say, hey, give me your shit. Why would they go and they walk her how many hundreds of yards into the wilderness and then kill her when they could have just taken her property and her vehicle right there? Because if they were able to coerce her and force her into the woods, they very easily could have just said, give me your shit, give me your keys, I'm taking your stuff.
So could it be the other option that I said? So either robbery gone bad or a robbery with intent to cause harm, like that guy had said for U.S. News. It was...
I don't know. I feel like she was targeted for some reason.
Maybe it was a sexual assault thing. That's
but
why
the autopsy
she's
doesn't say.
That's never been released. So I don't know if that is an aspect to this case. And or maybe, as horrible as it is, we know that there are people in this world who will target somebody specifically for that reason.
Right, and it could have been an attempted sexual assault with a weapon used to coerce her into the wilderness. She fought like hell, they said. And maybe this person couldn't enact their will on her.
Yes.
So all they could do was kill her. And then they grabbed whatever shit she had there and then left. So
maybe it wasn't a robbery gone bad. Maybe it was a sexual assault technically turned robbery, or an attempted sexual assault turned robbery, or burglary, theft, whatever you want to call it. They took her stuff.
I don't know if we can really nail down what type of crime it originated as.
Okay.
We obviously know it was a murder. Why was she targeted? Was it a sexual assault that went wrong? Was it a robbery that went wrong? I would believe that if she was led out to a clearing while being
held by
a person wielding a weapon, you would think that they're going out there to do something to her, not necessarily rob her. So if they're trying to do something to her and killing her wasn't the main objective to begin with, sexual assault is like the next thing you fall on. Then she's fighting them. She's a hiker. She's out in the wilderness. She can probably handle herself somewhat, at least.
Yeah.
And then the suspect can't do anything else but kill her in order to stop her from fighting, getting away, telling authorities about it.
Maybe I'm just thinking more along the lines with the theft, because they were supposedly having these types of issues in the area back then. So how can you completely police that in a national forest that is so vast? I don't think you really can. I think you can try.
Right, but I think that a robbery would have taken place where she parked.
Well, what if there was somebody else around and they were like, they stuck a gun up to her and they said, you need to move right now?
I don't know. I don't think it originated as a robbery. I know that these things were occurring in the area, but just because something was happening there at the time.
Well, now that we've talked it through too, and I think this is something that happens a lot where, I'll review a case and I'll research it and I'll be telling you the story, and then my opinion shifts as we go. And before we were even talking about this whole potential theory, sexual assault had not come up. It wasn't an option. So as we're talking it through, it kind of pops into your head to say, could this have been the option here rather than a robbery? So maybe I landed on robbery before, but now I'm a little bit more towards the potential for her being targeted specifically for this other reason, which could have been a sexual assault, and all the other things make sense for that.
And even if the autopsy didn't reflect that a sexual assault took place,
it didn't necessarily have to.
It didn't necessarily have to, because if Louise was fighting off her attacker and then they were forced to silence her the only way they could, which was stabbing her and killing her, what really has to get narrowed down is why was she targeted? And if she was targeted, was it somebody that was in the general area, the center or the lodge or just the trail in general? Was there another single party hiker that saw her roll up, or I don't know. I just have, when you have a gut feeling on something.
Yeah,
it can be totally wrong. I feel like somebody saw her when she was checking in at the trail.
But you feel like it is a stranger. It is a random attack. It wasn't someone that knew her or she knew her killer.
It was a stranger to her, but somebody from that area.
Yeah, I don't think it's anyone from Canada. I think it's someone from New Hampshire.
I feel like somebody saw her go into the center, check in with them and say, hey, I want to get a quick hike in, overheard the conversation, followed her out there.
And took the opportunity.
Maybe to try to sexually assault her, maybe try to rob her, or maybe just to kill her.
What a fucked up person.
I know.
I wonder if this was someone that did this regularly. Maybe frequented different areas, not even necessarily within the Appalachian Mountain Club or within, this particular national forest area or the White Mountains in general. But it feels like this could be an MO, what you're saying about them maybe overhearing. And what if this was just a prowler who spent time in these areas and eavesdropped and people watched and picked their victims that way rather than, we talked about it in Amy Mihalovic. It seemed like she had been watched, she had been talked to, she had been coaxed by this individual. That's somebody who's targeting a specific person and getting to know their routines and getting to know them rather than someone who's just out and about hoping that they'll find someone that they think is a good enough victim.
It certainly could be. I'd be interested to know what the statistics are for sexual assaults that occur along the Appalachian Trail.
Well, supposedly in that same article that I read where it said that there were 9 murders, it said there were also 9 rapes that were reported. But again, that's also reported, not that occur.
Yeah. I don't know. At the end of the day, I think that it was somebody that knew that area, that knew those trails, overheard her talking to the person in the center, that she was going on a late hike, wanted something quick, followed her over there, forced her into the clearing for whatever reason, and then because she fought, they ended up killing her.
I think that's definitely possible. Now, other than what I've told you up to this point, there really isn't anything else I've seen reported in this case outside of her family and friends pushing for answers every year. I will say, though, there is a podcast. I believe it's called Synthesis. I'm not exactly sure how you pronounce it in French, but they did a full 6-part series on Louise's case, but the podcast is fully in French. I really wish I could have listened to that to glean additional information because I believe they spoke with medical examiners and investigators and really got into as much as they could in the case. So any of our listeners who can speak or understand French, if you want to know more about this case, I highly recommend checking their podcast out. So with that, I don't really think we need to dive into theories, as I'm pretty much under the impression we've kind of solidified what we believe here, whether, we haven't come to the full conclusion on how said crime may have started, but we're along the same lines, I think, in what we believe here.
Yeah, we have a general MO. We have a stranger to Louise, most likely from the area, that coerced her as she was getting out of her vehicle to a secluded area within the woods, not too far from the parking area, for one reason or another.
Yep, exactly. And I think we both completely agree on that. However, some have made mention that they think the Connecticut River Valley killer or even Israel Keyes could have been responsible here, but due to the fact that not much really coincides with either of these serial killers and this case, instead of going over that, we will dive into the questions we're left with segment.
Well, I didn't really write a lot down this time because I don't really know what type of questions I would like to have answered to help further my thesis here.
Okay.
Obviously, if we were to look into a case file and we could see who was talked to, why were they talked to, who were the persons of interest, and kind of go from there, may help solidify or totally negate my idea or our idea of what may have occurred.
Yeah, I have a question that might help you.
Sure.
Then. So we found out later on that there had supposedly been a struggle, and that's kind of what I'm assuming, especially since authorities said that she fought super hard for her life. You would assume then that there would be a struggle. What I would like to know is where the signs of the struggle were. Was her car door left open? Were things strewn about? Or was it there was a huge pathway or like something within that clearing that indicated a struggle? Where was the struggle shown? Was it all the way from the car to the clearing? Was it only in the clearing? Was it on the trail? I think those things could be helpful to nail down exactly where this attack could have started.
Yeah, could there have been like displaced soil indicative of some type of struggle? Maybe somebody thrown on the ground but then kicked around type thing. Was there skin or DNA under her fingernails? Did she bite someone?
Yep. And then that could go along with somebody else seeing scratch marks or something like that on another person's body to say, now 20 years later, maybe they don't have that allegiance to them and they could come forward to say, back then, oh, he had scratch marks on his face, he had a bite mark, he had this, he had that, you know?
Right. Maybe to go with my idea of like a trail guide or something like that.
Yep.
They come home with scratches on their neck to their significant other and it's like, oh, you know, I got caught by a branch or I got caught by this or something like that.
Yep.
But yeah, that question of where did the struggle take place, what were the signs of the struggle, very well may coincide with the DNA that they have, the type of samples they have, where they found those samples.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question was there any blood or physical evidence found near the car, or did any of the physical evidence that they have strictly come from where her body was found in the clearing?
Right, and I had one other question, but I didn't know if it was really worthwhile asking is, was she killed in that clearing or then moved to the clearing?
So I think that was something that we talked about a little bit in the beginning where it was, we didn't know if she had been moved or anything like that. And it doesn't seem like that's been clearly stated either, but
I would assume most of the action that occurred happened in the clearing.
I agree. Yeah, that's what it seems like. But if there was any sort of struggle or blood or anything found by the car, then that I think could help in knowing how this all went down. And you obviously have to, when there's a car accident, you have to reconstruct the car accident to figure out the sequence of events in order to close a case. You can't ignore the start to finish part of it. You can't just look at where it ended rather than where it started and piece a case together.
Did you have any other questions?
Well, you answered one of mine before. It was why steal the keys but not her car? But of course, it makes sense to not do that because now you're going to be driving around somebody's vehicle that has now been found murdered. So
right, but to refute that too, if she was attacked initially at her vehicle, the keys may have been out in the open.
Yeah.
And maybe this person took the keys and just hucked them.
Maybe, but you would think maybe someone would have found them by now?
You would think so, but I mean, as time goes on with snow and animals and leaves falling and people walking through areas, could have thrown it in water, a stream, something.
So then that makes me want to know then, have they ever gotten any leads regarding the items that were missing? Do they have one or multiple of them and aren't releasing it?
Yeah, I think that they're sitting on a proverbial gold mine as far as the DNA and stuff.
Yep.
But
that is huge for this to be a stranger and to have DNA. These are the types of cases I feel like are so hard to solve because you can't piece a relationship together to try and say, if it were a spouse, if it were a friend, and look at their correspondence over time, say they called each other, emailed each other, talked, and see if there's any hostility, nothing like that. You have no way of building a motive. You have no way of building anything in a case where they didn't know each other. So I think
you just have people from the area.
Exactly. And if nobody saw anything, I mean, this is a vast area.
In one respect, it could be almost a boon that there's no real tie to a significant other because you have a clean slate to work off of, essentially.
Yeah.
With no biases pointing towards a particular person. This is one I would like to really see
a case file
on. I think that there's something to be said about authorities coming forward and saying in 2014 that allegiances may have changed.
I'm really glad I mentioned that then because I always just wonder, is this just a normal plea to the public every couple years because they want to just keep it in the public eye, or could this mean something? So any little bit of movement in a case I think is important, and you totally showed that to me here, because I do question it on occasion where it's like, is this an important comment by police, or is this just I have to do this because I am law enforcement and we're required to do this type thing?
I think there are certainly instances where that's the case.
But you can't not talk about them.
Right, but in this case in particular, I feel like that was said at that time for a reason. Not because, family members are wanting more answers or friends are wanting more answers. I think that something happened, and allegiance indeed did change in that area, and I think that they came forward at that time and said that because they know that somebody has more information and was withholding that because of whatever type of relationship they had with a person of interest.
Yeah, but that's 8 years now. So I wonder...
I'm sure Louise's daughters are still fighting for more work to be done on the investigation. I mean... As
are her friends. Those friends are so involved as well.
Her older daughter's not much older than I am. She's probably early 40s.
Yeah.
So I wonder what they're doing.
I hope that the French podcast maybe helped to push things a little bit more. I know it's hard, especially when you're looking at a case in another country entirely, but also you have a language barrier.
I think that's a problem, though, because it's a French podcast, because it's in French, and this crime occurred in the U.S.
Yeah.
You're losing a big audience there that may have information specifically because of that language barrier.
There was mention in a couple articles that the podcast had not yet been translated into English, so I don't know if they're working on that. I think that would be really cool to see, so I'll definitely keep an eye out if it does ever get translated, if people want to listen in to the 6-part series. I also don't know if they have transcripts. Maybe they do, that you could have those translated into English. But again, that's hard for anyone that may have information that doesn't speak that language. But at the end of the day, Louise's killer deserves to be behind bars for the heartache they've caused her family and friends. Hopefully, with advancements in DNA and the help of the public, that can become a reality. As a friend or loved one of the person who might have done this, if you know anything about it, please do not keep quiet any longer. As Dennis Masson, Louise's friend, said, quote, "I think in English, the term closure, which we don't have in French, is very appropriate. It's, you never get your friend back, but at least you know what happened." If you know anything about who killed Louise Chaput, please contact the New Hampshire State Police Cold Case Unit at 603-271-2663. Thank you all so much for tuning in every week. We're so happy to have you here. Make sure to leave us a 5-star review before you go and follow us on our socials.
You can follow us on Instagram at wicked.deeds.podcast and on Twitter at wickeddeeds. Don't forget to visit our website, wickeddeedspodcast.com, to take a look at any photos from this episode and view our source material.
But most importantly, tune in next week for an all-new episode.